Okay, anatomy students, new unit, nervous system, topic 1, introduction and functions. And if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, what are you waiting for? Take a minute and do that now. But let's get started on our lesson. So, the nervous system. What is the nervous system? That really is the first question that we're going to have to answer, right? It is a fast electrochemical communication network that allows us to communicate with and react to the environment, as well as to perform life activities like everything: sleeping, eating, walking, running, breathing, everything. What are the primary functions of the nervous system? So what does the nervous system do in sort of a concise outlook? Well, sensation. Our nervous system is responsible for sensing changes to the body. Okay, so whether you move, whether you're sleeping, whether your body temperature goes up or down, okay, whether you breathe something in. Also, it's responsible for responding to the environment, and that involves primarily our 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Then the nervous system is going to integrate. So it's going to interpret those changes. So great, the temperature went up. Great, you breathe this in. Great, what happens? We have a cut, okay? Interpret those changes and then elicit a response. That response often includes muscular contraction or a glandular secretion like hormones, but not always. What is the functional unit of the nervous system? It's something called a neuron, and you can see one visually represented here. A neuron is our longest cells. So you have a neuron that goes from the base of your spine to the tip of your toe, the sciatic nerve. It's incredibly long. In giraffes, the longest cells can be 15 feet long because it has to get from the spinal cord to the furthest point away. The neuron can transmit signals from 1.2 to 250 miles per hour. And a lot of that depends on whether or not the neurons have this insulating called the myelin sheath. With the insulation, the signal travels faster. And just a little fun fact, there are about 100 billion neurons just in your brain. All right, so here's a general overview of what a neuron looks like. You can see there's a cell body, also called a soma. There are dendrites. Those are they're going to receive the signals, pick up the signals. And then the signal's going to go down that long axon. That axon will be, if you need it to be a foot long or 3 feet long, okay, an inch long, that's how long it's going to be. And then there are the terminal buttons or junctions at the end of the axon, and they meet up with the dendrites of the next neuron. What are the main divisions of the nervous system? Well, we have the CNS, or central nervous system. That includes the brain and spinal cord. And then we have the PNS, or peripheral nervous system, and here's Bell. And the peripheral nervous system has all of the other nerves. If they're not in the brain or in the spinal cord, they're in the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system includes sensory nerves that detect the changes in the environment. Belle wants to really say hi. And motor nerves that connect to the central nervous system to muscles and organs. So the peripheral nervous system. So let's look at the types of neurons present. We have motor or efferent neurons. And I remember this because it has an effect, okay? And that goes from the central nervous system to muscles or organs to have an effect, the motor or efferent neurons. So cause and effect. And then the sensory or afferent neurons, they carry the sensory receptors to the CNS, okay? And then we have interneurons. And interneurons are connections within the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. They connect motor and sensory neurons. Okay, so it's not a motor neuron and it's not a sensory neuron. It's an interneuron. All right, do you want to come on my lap? All right, so here you can see a sequence. You have afferent, that's sensory, bringing the signal. Here's our spinal cord. Okay, and then we have an interneuron within the spinal cord connecting to the efferent or motor neuron to have an effect. Okay, so sensory or afferent to the spinal cord, interneuron within the spinal cord, and then to motor or efferent. Sensory, afferent to the spinal cord, motor, efferent to the muscle or gland to allow the reaction, movement. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system has two main divisions, the skeletal or somatic division, and then the autonomic division. So what does the somatic mean? That controls our skeletal muscles. So somatic meaning body. Okay, it has our sensory input. So that kind of cycle we just talked about, it's responsible for voluntary movement and reflexes. And then we have the autonomic. So you think autonomic, kind of like automatic. It controls our involuntary muscles, so smooth and cardiac. It controls our organs. It controls our glands. All those things that you are not controlling voluntarily. So involuntary. And it can be influenced by thought and emotion. So you can get nervous. You can focus on your breathing, okay? But again, it happens involuntarily anyway, but we can influence it, at least some of the things. Okay, so we have the somatic and the autonomic. Now the autonomic divides further into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we have talked about this before, but now we're going to address it again. So sympathetic is fight or flight. Okay, it releases adrenaline. And in case you didn't know that, another name for adrenaline is epinephrine. So an EpiPen has epinephrine in it to stimulate that response. It is a rapid, involuntary response to danger or stress. Okay, it opens your airways. I think that's why we use it in an EpiPen, epinephrine. Okay, it opens your airways. It dilates your pupils. Okay. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, is rest and digest. So it's going to release a hormone called acetylcholine, and it calms your body down to conserve and maintain energy because that sympathetic or fight or flight response requires a lot of energy. Parasympathetic allows us to be calm and actually perform a lot of our bodily functions necessary to life, like digestion. So here's just a quick overview. So again, in parasympathetic, our pupils are going to constrict. When we're sympathetic, we're preparing to run. So our pupils will dilate. It inhibits salivation. Our heart rate increases. Our airways get relaxed and open, but it shuts down our digestion. Okay. So in order to have digestion occurring, we need the parasympathetic system to be activated. All right, so let's talk now about just the central nervous system. So the central nervous system receives, interprets, or processes and sends signals to the peripheral nervous system. Two parts again, the brain, the main control center, and then the spinal cord. And the spinal cord has a long series of nerves, and they connect and relay nerve impulses primarily from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. Now, the central nervous system is ridiculously important. So it has a lot of layers of protection. First, there's bone. So we have the cranium that protects our brain, and we have the vertebral column that protects the spinal cord. Then there is a layer of fluid called the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, and it is a clear, colorless fluid similar to plasma. And it circulates within and around the brain. It's in these little pockets sort of in the brain called ventricles, but it also circulates around the spinal cord as well, the whole central nervous system. And it helps to provide some cushion and protection from injury. But that's not it. There's more. So we have the meninges. Now the meninges are 3 layers of tough connective tissue. So there's the dura mater. That's a tough double layer on the outside. So that's the outermost layer. Then we have the arachnoid mater, And that's the middle layer of the meninges, and it's web-like. And then we have the pia mater, and that is delicate. It actually clings to the brain, even folds into all of those folds and creases in our brain. So that is closest to the brain. So the pia mater, then the arachnoid mater, and it really is web-like with a lot of space for the cerebrospinal fluid. And then we have the dura mater, that tough outer layer. And then we have the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier means the least permeable meaning it lets stuff in and out, capillaries in the body are found in the brain. It lets a lot of things in and out. So gases, glucose, those kind of transport easily. The plus is it keeps many potentially harmful substances like viruses out of your brain. Thank goodness. But it also keeps out some helpful substances. So chemotherapy drugs can't get across that barrier. Antibiotics can't get across that barrier. So we have to find other ways to treat infections in the brain and also tumors. Now, the blood-brain barrier is useless against fat-soluble substances. So things like alcohol, many drugs, and anesthetics are able to cross that blood-brain barrier. So think about it. If it's fat-soluble or lipid-soluble, it's going to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay. If it's not lipid-soluble, it's going to have a very hard time unless it's something for basic nutrition. Okay, and very small. Okay, so what are those layers again? Bone, cerebrospinal fluid. Look at all those little pockets of ventricles housing the fluid, and you can see it goes around the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have those three meninges. You can see here's the skull. Then we have that tough, thick dura mater. You can see the arachnoid mater, web-like with space for all that fluid. And then we have the pia mater, which is just that real thin clinging to the brain layer. And you can see at the base of this arachnoid layer, that's where you're going to see capillaries. And that is where you're going to look down here for the blood-brain barrier. Normal capillaries, you can see there's spaces where things can get in and out. And you can see there's this additional protection around the capillary that prohibits many substances from getting into the brain. Some basics about the brain now. The brain has two hemispheres, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. Everything from your eyes to your hands to your toes. Okay. In general, the left side is responsible for things like speech, logic, math, reading and writing. And then the right side is responsible for imagination and creativity and arts and music. Okay. Now that is not 100%. Okay. There is a lot of crossover. That's just the general overview. The brain has 4 lobes: your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and your occipital lobe. Okay, now each hemisphere has a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. So there are 2 of each lobe. Okay, one on the right hemisphere, one on the left hemisphere. So just a general overview. Occipital is going to be responsible for vision. Parietal, think about it, it's real close to your ears. It is responsible for hearing, also some related to learning and memory, language. Frontal lobe, okay, that is any voluntary movement as well as thinking, social behavior, your personality, that's all in your frontal lobe. And then your parietal lobes, that's responsible for a lot of sensory integration, so interpreting our senses as well as our body position. All right, now coming out of the brain are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So there's a right one and a left one for each one of those cranial nerves. Now, I'm not going to ask you to remember all of the cranial nerves at all, just the fact knowing that there are 12, but you can see there are ones that control vision, smell, eye movement. You can see there's quite a few nerves responsible for eye movement. There's face movement, there's taste, okay, there's neck movement. And those are all coming from the base of the brain, the cranial nerves. And then the spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And again, there's going to be a right one and a left one, but these are further kind of separated, the dorsal and ventral part of the nerve. The dorsal part is sensory, and I always remember it like dorsal. Remember that's the posterior side, but the dorsal, so you see the ORS, and then sensory has ORS. Slightly different order, but those letters are still there. So the dorsal part is sensory and the ventral part is motor. And you can see we have a sensory part coming in and then a motor part coming out. Okay. And you can see some crisscross as things are going from, remember, right side to left side. But in general, anything that is a dorsal part is going to be sensory. Anything that is ventral is going to be motor. Whew, this is a lot. All I want you to know from this is there are kind of clusters of nerves, these interlocked nerves called a plexus. And you have a cervical one, you have a cervical plexus in your neck, you have a brachial plexus, and it runs underneath your arm. You have a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus. And that's really just a thick cluster of kind of interwoven nerves, and they will eventually branch out and perform their specific functions. So here's just a quick overview of the nervous system. Remember, you have a central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system has either motor neurons or sensory neurons. If they're sensory neurons, they're afferent, and they're bringing information from our environment to the central nervous system. And then motor neurons are ones that are going from the central nervous system to muscles or glands, and they're efferent. Now, the motor neurons can either be part of the somatic, voluntary, you move it, you control it, skeletal muscles, or autonomic, out of our control, involuntary, cardiac, smooth, muscles that go to our glands and organs. And then the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into sympathetic, fight or flight, adrenaline, and parasympathetic, rest or digest, acetylcholine. Whew, that's a lot, but I find this chart helpful. So if you can visualize it, central nervous system, peripheral, motor, sensory, motor gets subdivided, somatic, autonomic. Autonomic gets subdivided, sympathetic, parasympathetic. I find the visual very helpful. If you're a visual learner, this will definitely help you. And there you have it. That's the introduction and functions in the nervous system, lesson 1.